I've always been someone who craved the unknown, the forbidden. The thrill of exploring what others feared was a passion of mine. Ever since I first heard about the deep web, I couldn't resist the temptation to dive into its dark corners. I was fascinated by the stories of forbidden knowledge, strange items, and people selling bizarre, often dangerous things. But the one thing that kept popping up over and over again was something called a dybbuk box. A dybbuk box is not just a regular box. It's a piece of folklore from Jewish culture. The legend tells of a cursed object, a box that houses an evil spirit known as a dybbuk. This spirit is believed to possess and torment anyone who opens the box, trapping them in a cycle of horror and misfortune. The box itself is said to be an artifact of unimaginable evil, often passed down through generations, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. There are many who claim that once you open it, you're bound to experience unimaginable suffering. But for me, the curiosity was unbearable. A part of me, perhaps the darker part, was drawn to it. What would happen if I opened it? Was it real? Or was it all just a collection of stories designed to frighten the weak? I couldn't resist. One evening, while scrolling through an encrypted marketplace on the deep web, something caught my eye. A listing simply titled, "Dybbuk Box for Sale. Open at your own risk." The words on the screen seemed to almost glow, an invitation to a forbidden realm I hadn't yet explored. The listing was accompanied by a blurry picture of an old, weathered wooden box with strange symbols carved into its surface. My heart raced. The price was high, far higher than anything I had ever seen for an item like this, but the seller wasn't asking for much else. No personal details, just an anonymous account and a cryptic description. The listing said that the box was cursed, of course. It mentioned that previous owners had either vanished or suffered horrific accidents. But the more I read, the more my curiosity grew. It was like something was calling to me from the screen. I hesitated at first, but that brief moment of doubt was quickly overcome. I was not afraid. I was, if anything, eager. After a quick exchange with the seller and confirming the transaction, I hit buy. My heart pounded as I wondered what I had just done. My computer screen flickered, almost as if the dark web itself were aware of my choice, aware of my curiosity. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, but I brushed it off as nerves. The wait for the package felt like an eternity. Each day, I checked the tracking information, wondering when it would arrive. I began to notice strange things happening in my apartment. The air felt heavier, colder, like the world outside had lost some of its warmth. At night, I would hear faint sounds, whispers that I couldn't quite place. When I checked, there was no one there. My pets, usually so lively and playful, began to act strangely. My cat, who had always been affectionate, would stare at empty corners for minutes at a time, her fur standing on end, eyes wide in terror. Was it just my imagination? Was it stress? Or was it something more? I didn't know. But I couldn't stop thinking about the box. Finally, the package arrived. It was nothing like I had imagined. The box was small but heavy, wrapped in old cloth. The corners of the cloth were frayed, the material worn out as if it had been through years, maybe even decades, of use. The box itself was made of a dark wood with strange, intricate symbols carved into its surface. Symbols I didn't recognize but instinctively felt were meant to keep something in or keep something out. The moment the package touched my hands, the air grew colder, and for the briefest moment, the shadows around me seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. I was aware of it, but I told myself it was nothing. Just my nerves, I thought. Nothing more. Still, something tugged at me. A sense of foreboding I couldn't shake. I set the box down on the table and stared at it. My heartbeat quickened. I didn't know if I was excited or scared. In that moment, I wasn't sure whether to open it or leave it closed forever. But deep down, I knew I couldn't resist. The unknown had always drawn me in. I had made a decision, and now there was no turning back. It felt like an eternity before the box finally arrived, but when it did, the sense of anticipation was almost unbearable. The delivery came late at night, just after the clock struck midnight. I had been pacing around my apartment, staring at the empty table where I had planned to place the package as soon as it arrived. The moment the knock on my door echoed through the apartment, my heart skipped a beat. I opened the door, and there it was. The package. I recognized it immediately. It was wrapped in old, dark cloth, its edges fraying with age. The fabric looked ancient, almost like it had been handled by many different hands, passed from one person to another over decades or perhaps even centuries. There were no return addresses, no identifying marks, nothing that would suggest where it had come from or who had sent it. It was just there. The weight of the package was unsettling, far heavier than I expected. I barely noticed the chill in the air as I brought it inside, the cold creeping up my spine like the shadow of something unseen. My apartment, usually warm and inviting, now felt colder, as if something had entered with the package. I placed it carefully on the table. The cloth around it had an almost earthy smell, like old wood and something rotten. My fingers trembled slightly as I began to peel the cloth back, revealing the box beneath. It wasn't just an ordinary box. It was dark, almost black, made of a thick, dense wood. The kind that, if you tapped it, would feel solid, unyielding, and unnervingly heavy. I noticed the symbols on the box immediately. They were carved into the wood with intricate precision. Symbols I didn't recognize, but they made me feel uneasy just by looking at them. The carvings were deep, almost as if they were meant to trap something inside, something powerful, something that should never be freed. As my eyes traced the strange designs, the feeling of dread in my stomach grew stronger, gnawing at me, but I ignored it. I had made my decision to open the box. There was no going back now. The first sign that something was wrong came when I set the box down on the table. The air seemed to thicken. It felt as if the very atmosphere in the room had changed, becoming dense and heavy. The temperature dropped rapidly, so much so that I could see my breath in the air, a thin mist of condensation forming in front of me. I took a step back, my eyes never leaving the box. My cat, normally curious and playful, sat in the corner of the room, staring at the box with wide, unblinking eyes. Her fur stood on end and she didn't move, not even an inch. Her pupils were dilated, her body rigid, as if she had seen something that terrified her. A sense of panic gripped me, but I pushed it aside. It was just a box, I told myself. A cursed object, sure, but it couldn't do anything unless I opened it. Right? I reached for the box. The moment my fingers made contact with the cold wood, a sudden chill ran up my spine, a sharp, almost electrical shock that made me flinch back instinctively. The room seemed to grow darker, the light from my overhead lamp flickering violently. I felt an odd pressure in the air, as though the space around me was being compressed, like the box itself was absorbing all the light and energy in the room. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my head, but the sensations didn't fade. If anything, they intensified. Suddenly, the box seemed alive. It wasn't just an inanimate object anymore. It felt as if it had a presence, something trapped inside it, something watching, waiting. My stomach churned with nausea. I quickly stood back, wiping my hand on my jeans, trying to shake off the sensation that something had just touched me, something unseen but very real. I took a deep breath and steadied myself. I had come this far. I had to open it. Whatever was inside, whatever darkness it contained, it couldn't be worse than the fear gnawing at me now. I stared at the box for a long time, my mind racing. I could almost hear the faintest whispers in the room, too soft to understand, but they're all the same. My fingers hovered over the latch, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, to forget about the box and its ominous promise of doom. But I couldn't. The curiosity was overpowering. I unlatched the box with trembling hands. The moment I did, the room seemed to grow colder still, the shadows creeping in on me from every direction. A wave of unease washed over me, and for the first time in my life, I truly feared what I might find. But I had to know. I slowly opened the lid, the creaking sound of the hinges echoing in the silence. And that's when everything changed. The moment I opened the box, the first thing that struck me was the smell. It wasn't just the musty odor of old wood, but something deeper, more nauseating, something foul, like decaying earth mixed with something metallic. I gagged for a second, covering my nose, but couldn't look away from the box. Inside, everything was dark. The contents were wrapped in layers of old, brittle newspaper, yellowed with age. As I pulled the first layer back, I noticed something odd. The paper was covered in strange, faded symbols, the same kind that adorned the outside of the box. My hands were shaking. My mind was racing. There was a sense of finality to this moment, as though opening this box would mark the beginning of something irreversible. But I couldn't stop now. I needed to know what was inside. I peeled away more of the newspaper, and that's when I saw the objects hidden inside. They were strange, unnerving. First, there were a series of old coins, tarnished and worn with time. They were unlike any currency I had ever seen, round but with strange markings etched into their surfaces. I picked one up, the cold metal biting into my skin as I held it. There was a weight to them, not just physical, but something more symbolic. They felt like they carried a history, a curse. Next, I found a lock of hair. It was tied together with twine, dark brown in color, but dry and brittle, as if it had been plucked from someone long ago. My stomach churned as I held it in my hands, the strands fragile and delicate. There was something unsettling about it, as though the hair was a piece of someone's soul left behind in the box. I dropped it quickly, my fingers feeling dirty, and I couldn't shake the sense that I was touching something far older than I could understand. Beneath the hair was a small piece of brittle parchment rolled up tightly, tied with a black ribbon. I unrolled it carefully, holding my breath. On it, written in spidery handwriting, was a message in Hebrew. I could barely make out the words, but I could tell it was a warning, a curse. The message seemed to writhe on the paper as if the ink itself was alive, shifting before my eyes. I knew I had to translate it, but part of me was afraid to. What if it was something more than just a warning? What if it was a command? A call to do something terrible? And then, at the very bottom of the box, was something that made my heart stop. It was a small, old candle. The wax was a deep red, cracked and broken as though it had been burned many times before. But what truly unnerved me was the shape of the candle. The top was shaped like a twisted figure, almost human-like, with sharp, jagged edges. I could tell, even without touching it, that it wasn't just a candle. It was something darker, something that had been molded with purpose. It was designed to resemble something sinister. The moment my fingers brushed against the candle, I felt a sudden shift in the air around me. The room seemed to grow colder, and the shadows on the walls lengthened. I heard a faint sound, something like whispering, but I couldn't make out the words. I froze, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stop, to close the box and get rid of it. But I couldn't move. The box had a hold on me now. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was just my imagination. But the whispering persisted, growing louder, as though something was trying to speak to me from the depths of the box. My eyes darted to the dark corners of the room, but there was nothing there. Still, the air felt thick, heavy, as if something unseen was lurking just out of sight, watching me. I looked down again at the contents of the box, and that's when I noticed something even more disturbing. The candle, the twisted figure, seemed to be moving. The wax was shifting slowly, as if it were alive. I recoiled, dropping it back into the box, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The moment I released the candle, everything seemed to stop. The air felt still again, the shadows receding, the whispering fading into silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something had been unleashed. The sense of dread that had been creeping up on me now settled deep in my bones. I felt a presence in the room, something that hadn't been there before. It was then that I realized the truth. The box wasn't just a relic of some ancient curse. It was alive in its own way. It wasn't the contents that had the power, it was the box itself. And now I had opened it. The room was eerily quiet now. The whispering had stopped, and the sense of foreboding that had hung in the air seemed to dissipate. But despite the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had shifted deep inside me, and I was no longer alone in the room. The shadows seemed darker, the air heavier, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It felt like the very walls were closing in around me. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination. I had just opened a box that was said to be cursed, of course I was going to feel unsettled. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Something had been unleashed, something I wasn't prepared for. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. The box was still on the table, its dark presence lingering like a heavy weight. I pushed the thought out of my mind, telling myself to simply close it and forget about it. But the temptation was too strong. My curiosity, which had led me to open the box in the first place, was still alive. I couldn't let go of it. I needed to know more. It was then that I heard it, the sound of something scraping against the floor. It was faint at first, like a distant whisper, but it grew louder. Slowly, I turned my head to the side, my eyes scanning the room. The sound was coming from the corner of the room, near the bookshelf. I froze, my heart racing. First, I thought it was just my cat. She had been acting strangely ever since the package arrived, and I assumed she was the one causing the noise. But when I looked over, she wasn't there. The corner of the room was empty as it had been moments before. The scraping noise continued, growing louder and more insistent. I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me, and walked toward the sound. I didn't know why I was drawn to it. Perhaps a part of me hoped to find an explanation, to reassure myself that there was a logical reason behind it. But I knew deep down that I wasn't going to find any comfort in the answers I sought. I reached the corner where the noise had originated, and there, on the floor, was a small, twisted piece of metal. I knelt down to examine it, my fingers brushing against the cold, jagged surface. The metal was worn and rusted, and I could tell it hadn't been there before. My breath caught in my throat. How could it have appeared out of nowhere? As I picked it up, a sudden coldness washed over me. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees and my breath fogged in the air. My pulse quickened as I glanced around, the shadows growing longer in the dim light. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something lurking just beyond my vision. I turned back toward the table, the box still sitting there, its dark presence looming over me. But when I looked closer, I noticed something strange. The candle, the one that had been shaped like a twisted figure, was no longer in the box. It was gone. My heart skipped a beat. Had I just imagined it? Had I somehow overlooked it when I was inspecting the contents of the box? But I knew I hadn't. I distinctly remembered seeing it there, twisted and malformed, resting at the bottom of the box. It was gone now, and there was no trace of it anywhere in the room. The scraping noise started again, louder this time, as if something, or someone, was dragging something heavy across the floor. I looked down at the metal piece in my hand, and my blood ran cold. The metal wasn't just any piece of scrap. It was part of something bigger, part of a larger mechanism. Something mechanical, something that was now active. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. Whatever had been inside the box, whatever malevolent force had been trapped there, it was no longer contained. It was free, and it was coming for me. I couldn't explain how I knew this, but the air around me felt thick with malice. Every step I took seemed to echo in the empty room, amplifying the feeling of dread that was steadily consuming me. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen, staring at the spot where the box had been, now eerily empty of the candle. The whispers started again. This time, they weren't just faint murmurs in the background, they were clear and distinct. The sound of voices, low and guttural, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stumbled backward, dropping the metal piece. My hands were shaking uncontrollably and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. I rushed to the table, desperate to close the box, to lock away whatever had been set loose. But as I reached for the lid, I noticed something even more disturbing. The box was open. I hadn't opened it again, not since I had first examined its contents. But there it was, wide open, as if someone or something had done it for me. The symbols on the wood seemed to writhe, shifting in the dim light, almost as if the box itself were alive. I stepped back, my mind racing. What had I done? What had I unleashed? The room felt suffocating. The air had turned thick with a cold, oppressive energy that made it difficult to breathe. I could feel it pressing in from all sides, an invisible force that was growing stronger with each passing second. My heart hammered in my chest and my hands shook uncontrollably as I tried to process what was happening. Someone was here with me. I could feel it even though I couldn't see it. The whispers had returned, low and guttural, but now they seemed closer, circling around me, slipping in and out of my thoughts. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, taunting, as if it knew I was the one responsible for letting it loose. The sound of soft, uneven breathing filled the room, though there was no one standing nearby. It was as if the air itself had become heavy with presence, suffused with an ancient malice that had been awakened. I tried to steady myself, to remind myself that I was still in control. I was in charge of the situation. I had opened the box, but I could close it again. I could undo whatever damage had been done. But as my hand hovered over the box's lid, I froze. A cold gust of air hit my face, biting and unnatural. The hair on my arms stood on end and the whispering grew louder, more urgent. It was almost as if the unseen force was trying to communicate with me, to warn me, or perhaps mock me for my arrogance in opening the box. The room seemed to be shifting, the shadows growing longer, twisting into strange shapes that moved with a life of their own. Then I heard it. A soft scratching sound like nails dragging across the floor, coming from the farthest corner of the room. I whipped my head around, expecting to see a figure emerging from the darkness, but there was nothing there. The corner was empty as it had been when I first entered the room. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what was happening. The room wasn't changing. I was. The shadows were distorting not because of any supernatural force in the room, but because my perception was being warped. I was seeing things that weren't there, hearing things that didn't exist. The presence that filled the room wasn't just an entity, it was manipulating my senses, bending them to its will. I backed away from the table, my legs shaky, my mind racing. I needed to get out of the room. I needed to escape this oppressive atmosphere before it drove me to madness. But no matter how far I stepped back, the sense of being watched never left. The air felt thick with the weight of something looming just out of sight. I turned toward the door, but as I did, the shadows in the room seemed to close in on me, blocking my way. I was trapped. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, and the temperature in the room dropped further. I could see my breath fogging in the air, the chill sinking deep into my bones. The presence was right there, just beyond the edge of my vision, like a ghost that refused to be seen, but whose presence was felt with every fiber of my being. I stumbled backward, my hand reaching for the light switch. I had to turn the lights on, anything to chase away the darkness that was closing in around me. But as my fingers brushed against the wall, the light flickered. And then it went out entirely. I froze, the darkness swallowing me whole. The air became even colder, and the oppressive weight of the unseen presence bore down on me, making it harder and harder to breathe. The whispers intensified, no longer just words but voices. I could feel them crawling through my mind, touching parts of me I didn't know existed. My thoughts were no longer my own. They were being infiltrated, twisted by whatever force had come through the box. Panic surged within me. I couldn't stand it. The weight, the pressure, the overwhelming sensation that I was not alone, that something was lurking just behind me, something with intent. My eyes darted around the room, but I could still see nothing but the endless void of darkness. My heart was racing, my body trembling, and I felt a deep, primal fear that I hadn't known existed until now. It was as though the presence in the room was feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every second that I stood paralyzed in the darkness. That's when I heard it. A sound that froze me in place. A slow, deliberate footstep. It was coming from behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know that something was there. The sound was unmistakable. I felt the pressure of it on my back, the sensation of something looming over me, just waiting for me to make a move. I was trapped. There was nowhere to go. The whispers grew into laughter, dark and mocking, echoing in my ears. The presence was toying with me, enjoying my fear, and I could feel it getting closer, its breath hot against the back of my neck, its grip tightening around my chest. With every ounce of strength left in me, I bolted forward, crashing into the table as I scrambled to escape. I didn't look back, couldn't, but as I reached the door, I heard the whispers in my ear, clearer than ever before. The last thing I heard before I broke free from the room was a single phrase, chilling and unmistakable. "You opened the box. Now you're mine." I didn't sleep that night. How could I? After what I had experienced, after what I had unleashed, I wasn't sure what was real anymore. The darkness that had followed me into my home clung to every corner of the room, and no matter how many lights I turned on, it was always there, lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside seemed like a whisper from whatever had come from the box. I couldn't escape it. The next few days were a blur. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things, that the fear and the anxiety from opening the box had left me on edge. But the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling became. It wasn't just paranoia. It was something worse. It was as if my very mind was unraveling piece by piece. It started small, objects disappearing from my apartment only to reappear in strange places. A book I'd left on the table would suddenly be on the floor, open to a random page. My phone, which had been charging in the living room, would end up in the bathroom, its screen cracked as though it had been dropped repeatedly. The strange occurrences were subtle at first, easy to dismiss as coincidences or the work of my overactive imagination. But as they grew more frequent, I couldn't ignore them anymore. The worst part, though, was the feeling that something was watching me. It was there, always just behind me, always just out of sight. No matter where I went or what I did, the presence was there. It was like being trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from, a constant, gnawing awareness that I wasn't alone. And then came the voices. I started hearing them at night, faint at first, just whispers I couldn't quite make out. But as the days went on, they grew louder, more distinct. Sometimes they were just murmurs as if someone was talking just out of earshot. Other times they were harsh, guttural voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was just the stress, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the voices wouldn't stop. I would lie in bed, terrified to close my eyes, because I knew that if I did, I would hear them more clearly. They were always there, whispering in my ear, calling my name, taunting me with words I couldn't understand. It was as if the box had left a part of itself behind in my mind, a part that was now digging into my thoughts, slowly eroding my sanity. The exhaustion set in after a while. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. I had to take time off work, but even then I wasn't safe. I couldn't escape it. I started to see things, shadows moving at the edge of my vision, figures that seemed to slip in and out of the darkness. There were times when I'd be sitting in my living room, mindlessly scrolling through my phone, and I'd glance up to find that the room had changed. It was like looking at an old, worn photograph. Everything was slightly out of focus, slightly wrong. And then when I'd blink, everything would be back to normal, but the feeling of unease would remain. It wasn't long before I realized I wasn't just losing my grip on reality. I was losing myself. My thoughts became fragmented, disconnected, like pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit together. I couldn't remember simple things, what I had eaten for dinner the night before, where I had put my keys. The sense of time became distorted, as if days blurred into one another. I couldn't tell what was happening to me, but I could feel it. I was slipping. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. The worst of it came one night when I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the box. I hadn't opened it since that first time, but it seemed to beckon me. The box was still there, in the same place where I had left it, its dark presence always hovering in my peripheral vision. The lid was closed, but the symbols on the outside seemed to pulse, faintly glowing in the dim light. It felt alive, as if the box was waiting for something. I felt a strange compulsion to approach it. My body moved of its own accord, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch the lid. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the voices urging me on, or maybe it was the overwhelming sense of curiosity that had always driven me to make dangerous choices. But as soon as my fingers made contact with the box, everything changed. The room around me began to distort. The walls seemed to melt and warp, the floor beneath me shifting like it was made of water. I could feel something pulling at my mind, something trying to break through, something powerful and malevolent. The box was no longer just an object, it had become a gateway, a conduit to something far darker than I had ever imagined. My vision blurred, and for a brief moment I saw it, the thing that had been haunting me. It was there, standing in the corner of the room, its form indistinct, a shadow that seemed to have no shape. It was staring at me, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I could feel its gaze, cold and unyielding, piercing into my soul. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the vision faded, leaving me gasping for air. I was on the floor, my hands clutching the box, my heart racing. The room was still and silent, but I knew that I was no longer alone. I couldn't escape it. No matter where I went or what I did, the presence lingered, following me like a shadow that I could never shake off. I tried everything, changing locations, speaking to a friend about what was happening, even consulting paranormal experts who claimed to have experience with entities like the one I had unleashed. But nothing worked. The whispers continued. The shadows twisted in my vision. And worst of all, it felt like the box was calling me. Days bled into weeks. My mind, once sharp and focused, had become fragmented. I could feel myself slipping into a haze, trapped in a state of constant fear and confusion. The box had become a part of me, its influence creeping into my thoughts, consuming everything I once knew. I felt like a prisoner inside my own mind with no way to break free. The strange visions intensified, and the whispers grew louder, clearer, more desperate. It was as though the entity that had been trapped within the box was getting impatient, eager to break free. One night, after what felt like an eternity of torment, I reached the breaking point. I couldn't live like this any longer. The fear, the exhaustion, the constant feeling of being watched, it had taken everything from me. I needed to put an end to it, to face whatever was on the other side of the box and end this nightmare once and for all. I took the box out of its hiding place, my hands shaking as I felt the cold, unnerving weight of it. The symbols on the outside seemed to pulse under my touch, as though the box was alive, reacting to my presence. The whispers started again, low and menacing, crawling into my mind like a slow poison. But this time I didn't hesitate. I had to confront whatever was inside, had to stop it from destroying me. I opened the box. At first, nothing happened. The room was still, the air thick with tension, and for a moment I thought that maybe, just maybe, it was over. But then, the darkness in the room seemed to grow, expanding like a storm cloud, thick and suffocating. The air grew heavier, colder, and I could hear the sound of something moving, something inhuman, something that didn't belong here. A deep, guttural growl echoed from the box, and I froze, terror flooding my veins. I could feel the force that had been contained within it stirring, pushing against the walls of the box as though it had been waiting for this moment. The lid creaked, and then the box exploded with a force so powerful that I was knocked back, hitting the floor with a sickening thud. The room went dark. I could hear it before I could see it, slow, methodical footsteps, like claws scraping against the floor, drawing closer and closer to me. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrambled to my feet, desperate to escape, but the room seemed to warp around me. No matter which direction I moved, the footsteps stayed right behind me, circling, stalking. And then it appeared. It was like nothing I had ever seen, a creature of darkness, its body a twisted amalgamation of shadow and something far worse, something far older. Its form seemed to shift, melting in and out of existence as though it was made of pure fear. Its eyes, no, its glow burned a sickly red, and the void that was its mouth seemed to stretch far wider than any living thing should. I could feel its presence even before I saw it clearly. It was pure malice, a reflection of the very fear and despair I had been running from for so long. It was staring at me now, its head cocked to one side as if it were studying me, taking its time. The whispers filled my ears, but this time they were not distant or vague. They were sharp, direct, and full of fury. "You opened the box," it hissed, the voice coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, as though it was inside my head and in the room with me. "Now you must pay the price." I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, my mind spinning. Pay the price, those words echoed in my mind as I realized that there was no way out. I had unleashed something beyond my comprehension, and now it was here, with me, for good. The creature took a step forward, its form shifting unnaturally with each movement. The very air around it seemed to warp, bending to its will. I could feel its power growing stronger, its hunger pulsing through the room like a heartbeat. It wasn't just after me, it was after my soul. I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but no words came. The fear that gripped me was paralyzing, suffocating. My throat closed up, my limbs numb. I could feel my mind unraveling as I realized just how insignificant I was in the face of whatever this creature was. I had thought I was in control, but I was nothing more than a puppet, a fool who had opened a door to hell without realizing what lay behind it. The creature stepped closer, and I felt a cold breath on my skin. I was about to lose myself, to become part of the thing that had been awakened. But just as the darkness reached out to claim me, I heard it, a sound, faint but distinct. The box. It was vibrating. With all the strength I had left, I crawled toward it, desperate, knowing that somehow the box was the key. If I could close it, maybe, just maybe, I could put an end to this. I grabbed it, fumbling with the lid, but as I did, the creature let out a horrific roar, a sound that shook the room to its core. But I kept pushing. The lid clicked shut with a final, resonant snap, and the room immediately fell silent. The presence, the creature, the whispers, everything vanished. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my heart still racing in my chest. I was alive. I had somehow survived. But the box was still there, sitting quietly in the center of the room, its power contained once again. For now. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if this nightmare was truly over. But one thing was certain. I would never forget what had happened. And I would never, ever open that box again. When I woke up the following morning, the world seemed oddly normal. The sun was shining through my windows, birds chirped outside, and the faint hum of the city in the distance reminded me that life, in some places, was still going on. But I knew better than to believe it. Everything had changed. I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And no matter how much time passed, the events of the past few days would haunt me forever. I didn't touch the box. After what happened the night before, I couldn't bring myself to. It sat there, in the same place where I had left it, its black surface seemingly innocent, like a relic from some forgotten past. But I knew better. I had felt its power, and I could still hear the echoes of the creature's voice in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the danger it held. It wasn't over. The box wasn't gone, it was still here, in my apartment, in my life, and I couldn't ignore it. I tried to go back to my daily routine. I went out, I ran errands, and I even went back to work, though it felt like I was operating in a daze. But nothing felt the same. My coworkers seemed distant, almost like I was a stranger to them, and I found myself unable to focus on the simplest tasks. My thoughts would wander to the box, to the things I had seen, the darkness that had nearly consumed me. And when the sun set, when nightfall came, the whispers would return, faint and insistent, just beneath the surface of my consciousness. It wasn't the same as before, but I could feel them, it waiting. I didn't tell anyone. How could I? No one would believe me. The rational part of my mind still tried to convince me that it had all been a nightmare, a product of stress and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something more sinister at play here, something that could never be explained away by logic or science. Something that lived in the dark, in the spaces between reality and fantasy. Days turned into weeks, and the fear continued to fester inside me, gnawing at my sanity. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature, the entity I had unleashed, was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. I couldn't let my guard down. Every creak in the floor, every gust of wind that rattled the windows sent a jolt of terror through me. I couldn't even sit in the living room without feeling the cold presence in the air, as if it were watching me, waiting for the right time to come back. But one thing I learned from this experience was that fear could never truly be escaped. It had a way of creeping into every part of your life, poisoning your thoughts, making you question what was real and what was not. I had opened that box, and in doing so, I had opened a door to a world I was never meant to see. I had touched something that wasn't meant for human eyes, and it had left its mark on me. I could never go back to who I was before. I could never forget what had happened, no matter how hard I tried. As time went on, I found myself obsessing over the box again. It was like a compulsion, a nagging thought that wouldn't leave my mind. I couldn't understand why I hadn't destroyed it. Why hadn't I burned it, thrown it into the ocean, buried it deep underground? But something kept me from doing it. It wasn't fear that held me back, it was something else, curiosity, the same curiosity that had driven me to open it in the first place. A part of me wondered if I had truly ended it, if the creature was really gone, or if it was simply waiting for me to make another mistake. I began to research more about dybbuk boxes, reading articles and forums, searching for others who had experienced the same terror I had. It wasn't long before I learned that many people had opened such boxes only to be driven mad or worse. Some had even disappeared without a trace. The stories were endless and the details were terrifyingly similar. Every person who had come into contact with one of these cursed boxes seemed to suffer in the same way: paranoia, hallucinations, and a growing sense of dread that never went away. It was as though the box marked its victims, branding them with an invisible curse. I wanted to get rid of the box, to put an end to it once and for all, but I knew it wasn't that simple. The curse was already in me. It had already found its way into my thoughts, into my soul. And no matter what I did, I couldn't escape it. I had to live with the knowledge that I had unleashed something I couldn't control, something that might be out there, waiting to return when I least expected it. The box remained in my apartment, a silent witness to everything that had happened. I couldn't bring myself to touch it again, but I couldn't throw it away either. It felt like I was stuck in an endless cycle, haunted by the past, unable to move forward. I had opened a door to something dark, and now, no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the consequences of that choice. I don't know what will happen next. Maybe the creature will return, or maybe it will simply fade into the shadows, content with the damage it has done. But I've learned that some doors should never be opened and some curiosities are better left unexplored. The dybbuk box is a part of me now, and I can only pray that one day the whispers will stop. Until then, I live with the knowledge that the darkness is never far behind. 16.